It's a Trump bump. This time on Poll Hub, the president gets his highest approval rating ever in a Marist poll. And just like that, lots of people who loudly proclaimed us fake poll think we're cool. And lots of people who thought we were cool now think we're a fake poll. Well, maybe not. We're going to take some Twitter questions and comments and explain why we are not a fake poll and why maybe we're not all that cool either, but we can live with that. Also, tariffs, Russian election meddling, and what's up with our friend at CNN, Harry Enten? Lots to do. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. I'm JD Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll, and this is Poll Hub.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
So you guys were at the Gridiron Dinner in Washington, and Barbara, you got to speak with the president, and then we did a poll, and he has his highest approval rating ever. There are many people who believe the fix is in.
Yeah, sounds like collusion to me. But actually, the president was very interested in hearing about his most recent poll numbers, which have been going up in a number of different polls. And also this week, we had our results, and we find that he is at his highest point at 42% among adults, among all Americans nationally, which is the highest since Inauguration Day.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you did talk to the president about at the Gridiron, and also we find in the numbers, is that when he seems to be talking about public policy, about his agenda, although in the short run people might not like what he's doing. We're going to talk about tariffs in a minute, and that's not necessarily very popular. And certainly the tax cut wasn't, but then over time it seemed to gain some popularity. Bottom line, when he seems to get into the agenda and policy stuff, people think he's being more in the presidential role and less on doing all these tweets and all the scandals and all the controversies and everything else.
Although Stormy Daniels comes up in the midst of all this.
Yeah,
a payoff, it doesn't seem like if you could step back and remember 3 months ago or 4 months ago, which none of us can because the compressed news cycle, it doesn't seem like it's all that different from any other kind of moment in time. You've talked about whether a poll is out in front and becomes the conventional wisdom, or becomes the set later on.
The outlier, which becomes the conventional wisdom.
Is that what you think this is? Or is this maybe just a bump?
My sense of it is his numbers are not also, 42 among all adults is not exactly breaking, the records. It just happens to be good for someone who's been incredibly low. We did see, though, that his numbers in the South had taken the biggest change in terms of having been upside down, and now he has a plurality of support in the South. So that's something that might be watchable down the road to see if that is trendable. But other than that, I'm not so sure this is not necessarily, I don't think, the direction he's going in.
Well, also, I think there are a couple of things here. First of all, Stormy Daniels aside, we have been having discussions about gun control. We've been having discussions about the economy and whether that's doing well or not. There were some rocky days with the stock market, but I think overall the economy has been positive, and certainly Americans give him credit for that. The other thing is that even discussions of tariff, whether, as Lee mentioned, whether the policy is popular or not, I think that he benefits from just having those kinds of discussions and dialogues in the public realm. And finally, I think I think it will be interesting to see and whether this theory kind of plays out with the whole issue of North Korea, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot of that with the potential meeting between the two leaders over the next several weeks, perhaps months, and we'll see if that in fact does benefit President Trump in terms of how Americans think he's doing in that role.
So let me ask you.
And let me just throw one more. And I hate to say this, but it seems like, and I hate to say this, but when it comes to Donald Trump, this is not new news. We've been down this road in many ways in others, mentions before.
Look, it's true. There's all these allegations. 26 women during the campaign.
Yeah.
He still got elected.
And I think people are reacting to,
Yeah.
as Barb said, when he gets talking about public policy, this is something that people. That's a little change, and maybe people are reacting to change. Again, the numbers are not breaking new,
except
new
except in the South, as you did mention, he's now right side up when his numbers were upside down last time around, and so I think that this is to be continued.
Okay, so Kate Ogden on Twitter, she tweeted at us, landlines, come on. I haven't had a landline in 15 years. You say 50% is cell-based? If my cell phone blocks unknown callers, you're not reaching me or a majority of voters. You got to find a better way. What do you say?
Barb, I'll let you handle this. I mean, I don't have a landline either.
Actually, we do mostly cell phone. Anywhere from half of our sample is cell phone only or mostly households. Now, understand, I think it would be helpful if we were able to pretty much do everything by cell phone. There are only a few households that are landline only. Mm-hmm. But we do find that a number of Americans have landlines, not necessarily the old-fashioned kind that plugged into your wall, but the ones that you can get through your cable company. Mm-hmm. And so it is a balance. And what's interesting is we find this a lot, that if people think that they cannot be reached, what we do is we try to reach someone on a number individually, and we keep trying to do that. And if we can't make it through to them, we do replace that number with a number which is geographically proximate to that particular number. Mm-hmm. So in polling, we kind of have this sense of, if we don't get a hold of you in particular, we do get a hold of someone who is likely to have similar views that you would.
And the rule is, of course, that in polling, you want to have everybody have a chance of getting into the survey. Now, if you don't have a mobile device, we have to have a way to reach you. And so that's why we do call people on landlines.
So, I mean, the bottom line on this is that every now and then, actually not every now and then, one of the most constant things any pollsters get is people saying, well, you didn't call me, so how could this be right? And the fact is that with hundreds of millions of Americans and a poll that polls 1,000 people, you can still have scientific, reasonable scientific certitude that these numbers are very close.
You probably have a better chance of winning the lottery.
Well, but also I think in our culture we have this value of individualism, that we are all individuals. We think uniquely, and we are separate and different from others. Unfortunately, in survey research, we actually make the opposite assumption, that there's probably 30 to 40,000 people just like each individual. So if we don't get someone specifically, we can move on to someone who is very close to you.
Okay, real quick, one other, and this is from, actually I can't, they're all symbols in the Twitter handle, so I really can't help tell who this is. Anyway, that poll with a 3.8% error margin is hardly meaningful, just a bad guesstimate, or you picked some really thick-headed subjects, clearly someone who's not a Trump fan. There is this perception that we pick people, and that would be surmising we have panels of people that we do, and we don't use panels.
No,
Talk a little bit about
it's a random selection process.
So what does that mean?
And that means everybody's in the bucket and everybody gets pulled out.
If you have a phone number,
if you have a phone
cell
number,
phone or a landline,
you have an equal chance of getting into this pool. And I think also you have to understand that the so-called margin of error that people hear about is poor margin of error, badly named. It's not an error at all. It's a statistical allowance for a range that all polls have, depending on the number of people mostly that you survey. And so it's not really an error. It's that all polls are estimates, and it falls within that range doing the poll. And there's a lot of sources of inaccuracy in polls. Lord knows that we have to confront all those, from how we pick people, questions we ask, how the interviews are conducted, how we analyze the data. There's all potential things that can move us away from the actual number. That's what separates a good poll from a bad poll.
And I think also that we have had Trump's approval rating in particular in a very narrow range. He's been from the mid to the mid 30s, and this is really the first time we at the Marist Poll have had him even in the 40s since inauguration day.
Still within the error margin of some of the polls are showing 39
Right.
and 38. And I must say, and this is something maybe for a future podcast, but Barack Obama was sort of in the mid 40s for a long time, and we used to have presidents kind of go up and come down depending on events. And now we're seeing, people are for you or they're against you, and there's not a lot of movement. This wasn't a lot of movement. It was only noteworthy because it was some movement and in a positive direction.
Yeah, so we'll see if there's a trend there. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Yep.
Is, a month from now, 2 months from now, does this hold, or is it just this just a bump? One Heather Long tweeted at us about this. She was actually tweeting at somebody else who had tweeted a particularly kind of rude tweet at our poll, and she noted the approval rating is highest since taking office and above water in the South, like we just discussed. But she said this: feelings are lukewarm on tariffs, though, with 64% of Americans thinking the tariffs will make their costs go up. So we did ask about tariffs, and that is correct. 64% say they think the costs will go up. That doesn't sound like necessarily a good number for the president, but is it? Is it what it seems on the surface?
I think the tariff has, created a lot of dissonance in places where the president would not have wanted it to. For example, many in Washington and many of his, Republican, more established leaders. I mean, the idea of moving away from a market base to a tariff is sort of blasphemy to those folks in the Republican Party, and we saw that in Gary Cohn, stepping aside and resigning. What I thought was very interesting in the data: yes, people think prices are going to increase, and yes, they think it's going to hurt more than it's going to help.
A plurality of Americans think that. 42% think that it's going to hurt the economy. 27% think it's going to help. But almost 1 in 5, 18%, don't think it's really going to make any difference.
And the first thing I looked at when I saw this question and the results was, how are Republican voters around the country, how are they reacting? Because we've heard that this is really going to drive a wedge, really a split within his Republican base. And a lot of people in Congress were sort of saying, no, Mr. President, we don't want to go this way. And yet, among Republicans, 45% were supporting the tariff. These are Republican voters. 23% say no. So, yeah, there's some negativism there, some fallout, but it wasn't exactly,
But that, what that really points out to me is this notion that Republican voters and the Republicans in Washington are all aligned. And what Trump proved in the last election was that the Republican Party had drifted pretty far away from it, at least some of its base. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the urban, well-educated, that part of the Republican base was probably not terribly solid anyway, and they're kind of Democrats or independents now, at least under this president. But the Republican base, as it is in the South and the West and smaller town and rural,
very much intact.
Trump has from day one had his finger on their pulse a lot better than the Paul Ryans and Mitch McConnell.
So some of the leaders in Congress may be influenced by that kind of traditional Republican stance and less about the fact that the party has been Trumpified.
Yeah.
Well, also, and I think we see that in the numbers. When we take a look, we do ask a question about, how people describe the place where they live. Do they think of it as a big city? Do they think of it as a small city, suburb, a small town, or rural area? And we do see a very different impressions about the tariff depending upon how people describe where they live. For instance, 51% of people who live in a big city and 46% of those who live in small cities, and in fact, almost half of those who live in suburbs think that the tariff is going to hurt. But among residents of rural communities and small towns, people in rural areas, 39%, nearly 4 in 10, think it's going to help, and only 29% think it's going to hurt. People who live in small towns divide. 35 think it's going to hurt, 33 is going to help. So I think we're seeing not just a polarization among Democrats and Republicans, but I think we're also seeing the difference between urban and rural America as well.
Right, and Ron Brownstein would argue that that is actually the Democratic-Republican split now as it's been moving. So we also asked about Russia, and we've been asking about this for the last couple of polls. Every few weeks we've been asking to see if Americans believe that Russians are going to interfere in the election again in 2018. I got all riled about a month and a half ago when the numbers were pretty low of people believing that, including Democrats, when on that very day we were asking the top leaders of an intelligence community had testified in front of Congress that indeed the Russians were already involved in messing with the 2018 elections. Americans are coming to my way of thinking, it looks like.
Yes, you've now reached majority. So I think the last time when we looked at this, not when you started railing against America,
but in late February, the numbers had come up to 48%,
and now they're at 51%. So
I have some bad. But so I look back to February of 2017, a year ago. Now think of what's happened on this topic in a year. It's been almost a daily drumbeat. President Trump has done nothing wrong. 40% has fallen to 36%. Well, that's not much of a difference at all. Has he done something illegal? 19% think yes. Now 26% in a year think so. So these are not exactly earthquake changes in the reaction of President Trump, in spite of the Mueller Commission, which people think investigation, which people think are generally fair, and they want him to complete the investigation. Nonetheless, in terms of people's reaction to Donald Trump and what they think has gone on, there's been an awful lot that has occurred in the press and the media, and people are not reacting necessarily to it. Sorry, Jay.
And a good friend of the Marist Poll, who was at 538 and is now at CNN, Harry Enten, wrote a column. He's just started at CNN, so this is kind of not maybe his debut, but pretty close. And Lee, you had a bit of a bone to pick with him on this.
Yeah, I read this, and I fear to go in against Harry because I've respected him enormously on everything he's written, and
he's kind of really smart,
and he's kind of like really, really bright. So you take a big risk, but he says in his article, Trump is unpopular, but he's actually gained support since Election Day. Now, our poll has showed that he's gained a little support in the most immediate time, but since Election Day, so we went back and looked at his numbers. Now, what Harry did, and this is the bone to pick, he went back to the numbers for Donald Trump before the election, and then what they are in current polls among 6 or 7 pollsters, ours included, and he found that there's been a shift in Trump from in a positive direction in each of these polls. The problem we had with that is by going before election, you're taking a time where, the negativism is at its peak. So if you come off of that, then there's a likelihood that, in fact, things are going to look better if you're going to compare it now to, let's say, October when he was running against Hillary Clinton. So, for example, and I'll just finish this point out and then Barb can jump in, we had a 33-point negative rating for Donald Trump before the election. But then when he was elected, it fell to 9%. So if you compare our numbers now with before the election, we're comparing against a minus 33-point approval favorability. Well, he's going to look a lot better. And that's the case with all of them. Compared against a minus 9 then, well, things aren't so good. In fact, his numbers are worse and have gotten worse by 13 points since then. So, Harry, I'm not sure why you did it before the election. If you did it afterwards, we'll have to ask him, or maybe he'll respond.
Well, we'll get him on the podcast here,
we can do that.
And we'll ask him.
Barb, do you have anything to add to this?
So one of the things,
or are you going to let me hang out on this one?
No. I wouldn't. Even though you seem to be very wild about Harry, but I think that what we did is that we took a look at a different question. Because what we monitor mostly during a president's administration is the approval rating and how they're doing as president. And we actually start during the transition, just before they're president. And so in our last segment, we were talking about the president's approval rating being at its highest point since inauguration, but it was actually higher during the transition. When during that time, 49% of Americans approved of the job that President Trump was doing during the transition, and 42% disapproved. So when we take a look at that, we see that actually after Inauguration Day is when he came down.
No honeymoon.
There really wasn't a honeymoon after that. After a number of cabinet positions, were made, and so he's been in that kind of high 30s number since then, and just recently
it really
has come up.
But it points out both the danger and what people will point out as one of the problems with using data is that you can use data that is factual and true and accurate to make points by setting, in this case, an in point and an out point that may not be as relevant as if you slide that in point a bit. I mean, that's what you're arguing here.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that he would make this case because it does seem like it's an apples to oranges comparison a bit, and it's good for a headline, but it doesn't really tell the story as accurately as what you're suggesting.
Well,
So I think we're
Barb
also
said-
looking at this in terms of in terms of the midterms, because in the past, and we don't know that this is necessarily going to be the case in the future, but in the past, a president's job approval rating has really told us something about how his party is going to do in the midterms. So when we look at President Obama, when he was in his transition, his approval was 63%, and by this time in his administration, his approval rating had gone down to 44%.
Barely above Donald Trump's approval rating in the latest poll.
And then
And
he went
actually-
into the 2010 elections, which was Tea Party elections, where he got
Which was
shellacked.
a disaster.
I now
Shellacked,
remember
yes.
that word, shellacked. I
It was
didn't
a
remember
disaster
last
for
time.
Democrats and Obama.
Right. And actually, what's interesting is that's what the 44% is what he was doing among registered voters. And when we look at registered voters now and Trump, those numbers are identical.
He's at 44%. 42 is all adults. Yeah. Oh, well.
So, as Barb said, we're wild about Harry, and we'll find out after this program whether he's still wild about us.
Well, we'll invite him on
Yes.
and get him on a next, maybe not the next edition, but a future
Sooner
edition
after.
of Poll Hub. That is going to do it for this particular edition, though, of Poll Hub. This is a production of the Marist Poll here at Marist College in snowy, this time, Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our excellent executive producer.
And we'd like to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University. I'm a member of the board of the Roper Center, and we would not be able to look at all the trend data and survey questions over time without the great work that they do. And we encourage, as we used on this program, people not only to send questions to us at pollhub@marist.edu, but tweets are good too, and we will respond to those as we have on this program, particularly hard-hitting ones. Those are good.
Yeah, so definitely check us out on social media. We're Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. And please, wherever you are listening to us, don't forget to subscribe.